Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Zhang, for the introduction and the invitation to give the seminar talk. So it's my honor to be here and talk about our work. So I will focus on the work by the students in my group, focusing on sustainable, like a biomaterial for sustainable manufacturing and development. So most of the work done by my PhD students. I just play the role of the assembly. And they are here, so I'll introduce them to you as well. So my group, the lab is called Laboratory for Multiscale Material Modeling. So we take nature materials, we learn the structure, function relationship, and then we try to migrate those information to experimental system by designing the structure of synthetic materials or 3D printed materials, and then validate their performance with those synthetic systems. So the reason to focus on those biomaterials for sustainable development, so here I list 17 grant challenges listed by United Nations. So you can see out of those 17 topics, so a lot of them you can directly tell there's like a relation to material development. If you can get better materials, more functional materials, so you can greatly solve those questions like I highlighted. So that's why in my abstract, I say like bio and biomaterials, they are key to get like better future by answering those grand challenges. But if you want to solve those challenges, so there's no one can do all of them. But for us, we aim to develop something from the fundamental scale level. And then we develop new structures, new materials, and we aim to use those materials to solve many of those challenges. The method we use called multiscale modeling. So here is a schematic figure summarizing how this multiscale modeling is defined. So we can scale from the most fundamental scale levels, like below angstrom. So we study how atom interact, how atom and how electron they interact with the quantum mechanics or modeled by DFT simulations. And then use that, we can generate force field for classical MD and reactive MD simulation. And based on that, we can do the coarse grain modeling. We can do so apply to mesoscale studies to study the different material phases they interact and contribute to the composite mechanics of the composite. And then we can generate like a continuum scale constitutive laws for large scale simulation. For example, so there's some simulation movies showing how these simulations can be applied at different scale levels to study the molecular mechanics, the large scale behavior of spider web, or design composites that is reactive to temperature. Here is the peanut palm top coating, so it's sensitive to temperature, and they can change the shape once you change in temperature. So these just quick examples of the simulation of our methods. For our focus of the research is biomass, but biomass is like a mass. It's a collection of many like waste material for different sources. So it can be like agriculture waste. It can be forest, like cutting a tree and or cutting a wood board. So you can have like sawdust. So these can be like a biomass. So a huge amount of the biomass is composed like cellular-based biomass that's composed of carbon. So if we want to use these to create useful material, like the best mechanical strength and the lightest weight, so you can think of carbon fiber or carbon nanotube or graphene. So those are pure carbon atoms organized together to form strong network structure. So you can also discuss about how density can change Young's modulus and tensile strength. So and design different architectures for different mechanical applications. Or that's something like my previous work, like relates to the scaling law of carbon-based architect materials. Besides mechanical property, so we can also set up simulation to characterize the thermal property. So we can set one heat source and one heat sink, and we study how those architect structure conduct heat from one end to the other end. So we see like, so once you create the 3D geometry from the 2D graphing, so you also introduce a lot of defects like 5 rings and 7 rings to the structure. So that defect will disperse the phonon and make it difficult to conduct from one end to the other end. That's why considering about the thermal conductivity is over 1,000 times smaller than the thermal conductivity, like in-plane thermal conductivity of 2D graphing. Once you decrease the density, so the thermal conductivity further decrease because you have less like phonon. So because of the defect, so the phonon is more difficult. And also once you have lower densities, you have more air. So here in the simulation, we don't have air, it's vacuum. So that's why like more vacuum space, so less thermal conductivity. But so those carbon-based materials, they have lightweight, they can be lightweight, they can be good stiffness, good strength, and low thermal conductivity. But the issue for them is too difficult to make. So you need to use chemical vapor deposition or use other energy-intensive method like pyrolysis to create those structures. So these will cost a lot of energy or also equivalently to money. And it's not energy efficient, but then think how to use the biomass. So we think about like for nature, so there's a nature solution called mushroom. So they can naturally integrate biomass like the wood chips and fibers together to form the composite material, like what Ecovative Design is doing. So they grow the mycelium, which is the fiber of mushroom from the wood fibers, and then they can turn that into decoration of furniture or packaging materials. And naturally, the mycelium is also very robust. So once you have black mold, so it's relative to mycelium, so you will be very difficult to get rid of it. So they can live for a long time. And then they're also relatively easy to grow in the lab. So we can prepare a petri dish and then grow mycelium directly on top of the dish. So that's why we focus on this mycelium structure. And one of my students, Li Bing Yang, who's my first PhD student, start to focus on this study. So we first build a multi-scale feature of this mycelium study. We ask, so what's the material composition of the fiber? So once the fiber come together, so what's the connectivity between those fibers to define the network? And then at larger scale, so once you have a network, how fast can they grow? And once you have you take the mycelium from the petri dish and put it together with the biomass, how can they improve the property of these biocomposites later? So this is a time-lapse video showing once we have a initial like a block for the mycelium, so it can quickly occupy the entire petri dish within a week or 10 days. So, and here, this is the curve tracking from this movie showing how this area, occupied area, increased as a function of time. To see, so once you change the composition of this substrate, here is we use agar because that's a food grade and also very simple to handle. Also is bio-safe. So once we increase the concentration of the agar, so we effectively increase the stiffness of the substrate. And you see the growing speed also increase together with that stiffness. So that's something very interesting because here we intentionally control the nutrient amount to be the same, but we just change the agar amount. So that's suggesting, so the mycelium once it's growing, so it can also sense the stiffness of the substrate. So we have a paper in submission related to this topic. And after we grow those mycelium on the Petri dish, so we put it together with wood fibers as the biomass. So the wood fiber can be coconut fiber, can be stalk or corn, like straw after harvesting of the corn. So we use blender to convert those wood fibers into small pieces and grow mycelium together. So here's the microscopic image. So the thin fibers are mycelium, and the thick fibers, they are the wood fibers. So see, the mycelium, so they not only attach to the surface of the wood fiber, but they also form entanglement together with the wood fiber. So that's the way we believe the mycelium can play a role to bind wood fiber together, but also increase the stiffness and strength of the material. So Libin sent these like nice picture to MRS a few years ago, and he got this award. So it's a very nice image of the mycelium structure. But then we can use our simulation to hypothetically tell, like once you have mycelium, how significant it can contribute to the strength of the composite. So for example, so this is like a network of wood fibers with weak interaction. So if you don't have mycelium, so the wood fibers, they cannot strongly attach to each other. They don't have strong entanglement. So that's why once you pull them, they will break easily. But if you have a strong interface between those wood fibers, you start with the exactly same geometry. But then during the loading test, so you see those interactions, they strongly contribute to the strength and energy dissipation. And you have a lot of fibers, wood fibers, you need to break before it's rupture. So based on that, so we move forward to the lab. So we grow mycelium together with wood fibers, and then we culture the mycelium. After culturing, we turn that into dog bone samples, and then we use heat press to control the temperature and the pressure to press that into dog bone sample. And we do mechanical tests on each of those dog bone samples. And we analyze the results, and we build a machine learning model based on that to classify the strength, toughness, and the Young's modulus of these dog bone samples. And we correlate those mechanical performance to the treatment process. Like during the heat press, so we have the temperature under control, we have the amount of time under control, baking time, and also the pressure under control, as well as the material, the substrate type. So we correlate those processing conditions with the performance of mycelium, and then we build a machine learning model. So it's able to predict what can be the best combination of treatment parameters to strength, to modulus, to toughness. So that's the highlighted region by red color. So that's the cluster of the result correspond to the highest strength, modulus, and toughness. And then we can use the location of those regions to identify the optimal treatment condition for better mechanical performance. And recently, so we move forward with this topic. So, so Gargi in the lab doing the mycelium, but she wants to study the property of the mycelium at the interface. So including the thermal property. So we intentionally select metal surface because metal is very good in thermal conductivity. But mycelium, because of its low density and its porous feature, so we expect it to have a low thermal conductivity. So we coat the metal with mycelium, and we see we put this substrate on top of the boiling water, 100 Celsius degree. Then we use the thermal camera so we can visualize the temperature distribution on the surface. You see, for the region coated by mycelium, so because this mycelium is very thin, so once you use a thermal camera, it's actually recording the temperature still on the metal surface. not the mycelium, because this is very thin. So you see the region coated with mycelium, it has a high temperature, but the region without mycelium is lower temperature. Means the region like exposed to air, the heat dissipate quickly and then become a similar temperature like the air close to it. But the region coated with mycelium, so that heat cannot easily dissipate. That's why it's a higher temperature. We also show that the mycelium can also coat to other 3D structures. So we put the 3D printed structure in mycelium, and then they can also grow over time. This is hydrophobic, so it's a very good like this water contact angle showing hydrophobic surface and also tolerant to fire and temperature. So this image shows like once you directly test under the flame for the aluminum foil coated with mycelium and not with mycelium. So if you don't have mycelium, the aluminum foil, they will burn easily. But then once you coat it with mycelium, so they will first turn into carbon, and then it further protects aluminum foil from burning. So that's some preliminary results, and we are also like collaborating with Cornell University to do further quantitative measurement of those features. And for the bulk mycelium composite, so here we have an ongoing project with Professor Wilson, Bing, and Professor Zhang here at Center of Excellence. So we want to push the limit of this mycelium composite to apply to building envelope. So that's something like we can benefit for the thermal insulation and the lightweight of mycelium. So we are right now building some mechanical and material characterization lab downstairs, including a large green tent that can grow large size of mycelium blocks. Let's switch gears. So for biomass application, so another application for biomass like wood, if you think about like Adirondack area, people there, they might not, they're off-grid sometimes, so they need to use wood to burn the wood to get heat. But if you burn the wood or cellulose indoor without good ventilation, so they can turn into carbon monoxide. So that's something my student Ming Jian's asking, so how this carbon monoxide can get people into toxic state. And once it's toxic, how to get rid of this carbon monoxide. So recently we got a paper published, JCTC, and featured as a cover image for that paper. So to answer that question, so right now, the way to once you get like you get toxic by carbon monoxide is you need to go to a hospital, and then the hospital need to be equipped with the high pressure oxygen chamber, and then use that so you can get rid of the, and then fill the chamber with pure oxygen, and then you can get rid of the toxic state. But if you don't do that, if it's like a low concentration carbon monoxide, so you just headache. But if it's higher concentration, so you can lose your judgment. But if it's even higher, so it leads to death in 3 minutes. So it's not only for high concentration carbon monoxide is dangerous, but even doing the cooking at home, if you do a lot of cooking, so you can also get exposed to carbon monoxide and get to the low concentration, like a toxic state. So that relates to indoor environment and how this air can be will cause issue to human. So we build to solve the problem. We build an atomistic model of the hemoglobin, which is the key essential part in our red blood cells, and we study how the binding between carbon monoxide and oxygen to this hemoglobin. So once we start to do that, we realize there's no good force field existing for this interaction. So the hemoglobin, the key part to deliver oxygen is the iron. So that's the key thing to form the metal coordinate bond with oxygen and then deliver the oxygen to different places. But then once this position is replaced by carbon monoxide, then oxygen will be difficult to bind. So that's why it caused the toxicity. So as I said, there's no good force field. So we build our own force field. So we use a DFT calculation, and so it's AB initial statics calculation, and also CPMD is AB initial dynamics calculation. Use both of the results, so we can characterize the bound length and the bound energy, and use that as the input to train a force field and make the force field suitable for classical MD simulation. So the reason we want to do MD is because once we simulate the binding from carbon monoxide to hemoglobin, we also need to consider the water environment. But if we consider water, DFT will be very difficult to do the calculation, too many atoms. So just want to quickly show the performance of our force field. So in the literature, so these curves are the AB initial calculation, but the literature existing force field, they're not very well agree with the DFT calculation, but for our force field developed, so it have a much better agreement. And use that so we can simulate, for example, once you have a carbon monoxide and then it binds to the hemoglobin, the Fe atom, iron atom, and then you try to use a spring to pull it off. So during this simulation, we can measure the amount of force to pull this carbon monoxide from this binding state. But if you have, again, so this simulation, we put oxygen atom close to this binding site, and then we repeat this simulation to pull carbon monoxide away, and then we can measure how these oxygen bias the energy landscape for this attachment. So we see that once we put carbon monoxide closer and closer to this binding site, so the binding between hemoglobin and the carbon monoxide become weaker and weaker. So it means you can use, that's why the high pressure chamber, oxygen chamber can be effective to get rid of this toxic state. And we summarize the results, so showing like this bias stiffness that is proportional to the interaction, the constraint between hemoglobin and the oxygen. So once that increase, that means you force the oxygen closer to the binding site. So you see that the peak force to get rid of this carbon monoxide becomes smaller and smaller. So we are very happy about the preliminary results based on that. So we want to study, so if there's any small molecule that can be used to help to facilitate the kicking off of this carbon monoxide. So is there any way we don't need to use oxygen chamber or oxygen, but other like molecules? So we are referring to some like other medicines people are used to treat hemoglobin. For example, like this is a disease called SyracuseCoE disease. So once it happens, your red blood cells will turn into like the shape of a moon. So instead of a circular, rounded shape. And the molecular reason is there's a point mutation happening to the hemoglobin. And once that point mutation happens, the hemoglobin will assemble into the shape like a microtubules. So they get assembled. So, and then once they cluster and assemble together, so their surface area gets significant decrease, so they lose the effect of delivering oxygen. But people have done a lot of study for this disease, and they found there's some molecules like 5-HM, so these are small organic compound, so they can be effective to get rid of these like SyracuseCoE state. So we are testing those like compounds and molecules to see if that's also useful to treat the toxicity of carbon monoxide. So based on our simulation model, so we can study both the mechanism of this disease, but also maybe later we can use these small drugs and the force field we developed to treat the carbon monoxide toxicity. Other than that, so once you, I hope I'm not switching gear too much, but I show like how to use biomass. And then if you don't use that biomass wisely, what can be the consequence? And here, so once you have different biomass, how to put them together to form a very strong and tough material. So to start, so I put a picture here. That's a picture of a clam or a nacre, a shell of the clam. So we know like that shell is very tough. So that's why once they can survive in the ocean. And then once there's a wave from ocean and they get impact to the rock, they don't get easily smashed. So some of our previous study is like a study how these nacre design can be good to strength and the toughness of the composite. So we've done the 3D printing and then combine the rigid material and soft material to design the architecture that mimicking the nanostructure of nacre. And we found both the geometry and this heterogeneous material combination is crucial to the toughness of those nacre inspired structures. That's why like here, once we think about like how to convert those biocomposites into stronger materials, so we can refer to those lessons from nature. So then because the aim of the research is for high toughness, so it's not only relates to this goal not only relates to composite material development, but can also relate to large scale like engineering application. Because for the composite, so here the case like you can always have a defect, structural defect or crack, or sometimes you need to have some like circular holes for functional applications. But if its material have those defects and cracks, so based on our basic mechanics of material class, there will be stress concentration. And the failure of the material always start from the highest stress concentration point. And how to improve the design of these composites and make it not that sensitive to those defects and crack. So that's the question for the composite design. But to engineering design, like tunneling, so once you create a tunnel, so you cannot just drill a hole there. You need to figure out a way to reinforce the tunnel to prevent it from collapsing. So people have done those related study and show you also need some heterogeneous material distribution to reinforce the top of this tunnel to make it less difficult to collapse. Other application, like if you have a tough material, can apply to like foam designs to make it difficult to fracture or smash in impact. So we switch gear to study the crack and failure of materials. So some this is a quick example showing how nanomaterial fail. The reason I pick up that is like for nanomaterial, you have very clear visualization of how atom by atom this crack can propagate. So if you check the frontier of the crack, so those low dimensional material might give you the highest resolution if you can see the behavior of every single atom around the crack tip. So those three like typical two-dimensional materials are widely used semiconductor, graphene, MOS2, MXene. So current semiconductor is still heavy with to use silicon, but future application or future development of semiconductor, people have like repeatedly proposing to use low-dimensional materials. So graphene is a single layer atom. MOS2, molybdenum disulfide, so that's 3 layers of atom. And MXene, that's 5 layers of atom. So they all called two-dimensional materials because most of the atoms, so they lay in the plane. Okay. So this work is done by my student Camilando Paul. So he take all those different two-dimensional materials and then run the molecular dynamics simulation to study how they can fracture. So if you don't do anything and then you just take the pristine material, so you see like under loading, so there will be a strong stress concentration at the crack tip And then once it starts to propagate, so it will propagate through the entire materials. So the maxim, so more plastic and flexible, so it's like it fail later than the other two materials, which are more brittle. But a way to enhance the toughness of this material to make it less affected by the pre-existing crack is to just borrow the concept from nature, is to create some nano architectures. So we just simply create those like bridge structure, and that like separate these, turn that from a continuous 2D material into a like isolated bridge structure. So we think like if it's a continuous, there will be high stress concentration, but if it's become this like a bridge structure, the stress gets more distributed. So here is the comparison for the simulation movie. I just quickly click all three to see like once you have a crack, so the crack will not instantaneously propagate in the straight line, but it will go around each of these bridge and then tend to break those bridge instead of catastrophic failure. So that's a work we recently published, Mechanics of Materials, and also like selected as the cover image for this paper. So the architecture is important. I also want to say that the how to make the flexible material phase, like flexible means low Young's modulus, but also high strength. So that's also a key to improve the strength of the composite. So back to study several years ago, so we focus on the mechanics of cytoskeleton. So which is here is the intermediate filament called Wymenting. So that significantly contribute, it's called safety line of cells. So once you have impact force, and then this intermediate filament will will just like a bungee cable to protect cell from rupture. Here in Syracuse, Allison also studied those in the experiment for the Wymenting intermediate filament. So here in my simulation, you see, like once you start with the intermediate filament, but you start applying loading force. So at the end, so it will not fracture, but instead these alpha helix, they get unfold and they can sit into beta sheet structure. So that significantly contributes to the strength. The alpha helix at the beginning is very flexible, but at the end of the pooling, so it becomes a stiff material and much more difficult to break. So based on these atomistic simulations, so we built the coarse grain model to visualize that once you have a small network and you apply loading to these intermediate filaments, so because of this hyperelasticity and stiffening behavior of the fiber, so they will not crack immediately, but you change the shape of this crack significantly from a single line to an ellipse. So that reduces the concentration of the stress, and that makes this network much more difficult to fail. So here, this color nodes means the different stress states of the filament. So beginning is blue color, but then if you have more and more like larger deformation, it turns into a red color. So that's about to break at the end. You see, like for this small network, so it turns into a totally like a vertical ellipse. So means the stress concentration at the two ends, they get much smaller than the beginning. Okay, so those two bases, so we want to study the architecture, and we also want to find the material, like the binding material between those blocks, so that's like much flexible, and it will fail at much larger strength, so like ideally to be hyper elastic. And then we can mimic nacre, and then we can combine the stiff, the rigid phase, and the flexible phase. And we aim to obtain a material at the intermediate of the elastic modulus, but at much higher toughness. Because for modulus, it still depends on the modulus of each component, building block of composite. But toughness, they can get much larger than the individual materials. And the general study is to get the design, like the sample overall shape and the boundary condition, but discuss how the material gets distributed. And then we can optimize the distribution of the material and then generate the geometry, do the 3D printing, and do the validation. So I'll quickly show some previous results. This is some of the collaboration with grade school from Berkeley. We had that a few years ago. So at that point, so there's no much machine learning algorithm. We just use the greedy algorithm. So we discuss for each pixel here, this is 8 by 8 and 10 by 10. And then each pixel we can note is like either 1 or 0. So 1 for rigid material, 0 for flat, soft material. And then the elastic matrix of the entire sample can be given as a function of the stiffness of each pixel. And then we can determine the loading force by using a finite element method to solve these constitutive law. And then further, we can get the stress and the strain distribution. So the reason to start with this small number of lattice 8 by 8 is the computational capability. Because the more lattice you have, the more possibility you can get. So if you have like 10 by 10, so you have 2 to the power of 50, like that's huge possible conformations. But by use greedy algorithm, still we can obtain some like a local optimal geometry, and that can dissipate the stress. So later, so once there's machine learning method, so this lattice number can increase to around like 100. And then you can just use a small amount of training data obtained from finite element simulations to train the machine learning model and directly predict and categorize what can be the best conformation that give you the higher strength. You can also change the objective function to be either just the toughness or the combination of toughness and the stiffness of the material. So to further reach like some optimal designs for those composites. And at Northwestern, so Professor Wei Chen, so she studied like these problem with the background of large scale like constructions, like the tunneling problem. So they study like if you have a different like tunnels, so how to design the distribution of material stiffness to prevent the tunnel or those architectures from collapsing. So basically, they don't consider like a heterogeneous material distribution, but consider different architectures that can lead to different stiffness, and that effectively also consider about their distribution to get a high strength of this entire sample. So I will use 2 examples to see, like, show you how we think about those problems. So first is about like bamboo. So the background of this study is traced to many years ago. We started to consider a bamboo material. So bamboo is a lightweight material for construction, and it has a very like high hierarchical structures. So to think about like the thickness, along the thickness. So you have more pores for the inner surface and less pores for the outer surface. And then if you check the outmost surface of bamboo, so interestingly, so it's not just cellulose, but there's a lot of silica particles. So these silica particles get embedded into the surface of bamboo and make this bamboo surface strong. So it's where you use your knife to hit bamboo, and unless you use very large like force, then it won't easily create a crack. And then here in the microscope, we see like once there's a mechanical fracture, so this crack will not penetrate through those silica particles, but they will tend to wind around the silica particle. So that's suggesting this is like good for energy, higher energy release, because that creates a much longer pathway once they need to fail, the material need to fail. And here is back scattering image showing like those silica particles, they're really rich in silicon instead of carbon. So we have atomistic simulations and then study how cellulars interact with the silica of bamboo. And we show that once you try to deform these cellulars, so instead of fail at the interface, so these cellulars will fail inside itself. Means the interface between the cellulars and the silica is very strong. But still, it doesn't explain like why these conformation of the silica distribution contribute to the toughness of bamboo. So here you take a look at this SEM picture. So you may say these silica distribution are random, but if you take another look, so it seems like it's not random. Well, because if you just randomly generate the pattern of distribution, it won't be very similar like those. We try different ways. We try to select tiles and then use that as a representative unit, but still like very different from the overall distribution of bamboo. So then we think about like maybe our human eye is difficult to read this pattern. Can that be read by machines? So you may heard about these like generative AI, like recently the Sora. So by OpenAI, they can generate image similar like human beings. So maybe the machine can identify this high order inside bamboo than us. We just give some try. So we did not use this open AI method. We use a much older algorithm here. It's called DCGen, Deep Convolutional Generative Network. So, but that captured the essential idea of generative AI. So you have two agents, one responsible to generate some conformation. The other agent is responsible to distinguish the generative image from the input image. And both of the agents, they will evolve and become more and more expertise at their work. And then at the end of the day, so you can generate some synthetic image just very similar to the original one. So it's also a very good method to generate massive data to do more tests. So here I just give a bigger picture. So if I take one of the single like a piece of the material and then put it together with another synthetic image and don't tell which one is which. If you don't have a lot of training, so maybe it's hard to tell the difference. And then we use those generative conformation and then use them as the input to do a mechanical test. So we assign the particle with the mechanics of silica, and then these matrix with the cellulars, and then we do a lot of tensile tests on both the original SEM picture and those generated image. And we show that they have very similar strength and toughness and stiffness. So means the generative AI, those image, not only visually being similar, but they might also capture some like orderness in the particle distribution. And we compare this result with the 3D printing. So the original one give a high toughness, and then those like tiles, so their toughness lower, and then random distribution give a much worse performance. So we also need to have a few tests based on this generated image, but yeah, that will be done. And then the application of this work, so we can apply this method to like 3D printing. by using the liquid metal with the thermoplastic polymer. So we have a collaborative work published with Wei Nan at Argonne University. University of Argonne, and then we can use the simulation and to predict behavior and use this generative AI to generate more data to test in the simulation. But another thing, like for bamboo, the silica particle, so that's similar like the deciding the location of the soft material. So that's an old question because consider the possibilities. So changing the position of the particle or changing a few soft pixels. So that's have a few degree of freedom. But if you consider the entire region, and then the rigid material and soft material, they are almost similar amount. So that probability will be much more. And that might not be able to effectively solve by the previous method. So that's why one of the students in my group, Milad, he's here. So we study the new research by study the arbitrary composite with like almost like equal concentration of the rigid and soft material, and then solve that with the generative AI. So he used stable diffusion, so which is much more powerful and generate effective, like a good visualized image than the DC GAN. So this study started with some like image that we obtained from molecular dynamics simulation for the stress distribution of this composite. And then the generative AI just learned the stress distribution and directly predict the material composition together with the stress distribution. So once we have these models, so we don't need to run some like get some like design and then do the simulation to predict the stress field and then select which design can be better. But generative AI that generate all the possible conformations and the stress distribution at once. So here, just some examples. So these images are fully synthetic from generative AI. Then we can take the conformation of the material distribution and then take the MD simulation to run and get the actual stress distribution and then compare the difference. So pixel by pixel, there's still some difference, but that difference is very small. And then the biggest advantage of this method is, you might heard like machine learning is data hungry, but with this generative AI, no longer data hungry. So you can just give 100 images, and then that will give you a great prediction and a great model. So you can use that to generate many conformations with the stress distribution at the same time. So how to use those stress fields? So we need to correlate that stress field to material property. So we can take the stress field, we can do the average to calculate the applied stress, and then we can generate many like paths, and based on the paths, we take the integral and calculate amount of displacement. And then once we have the stress and the displacement of the sample, so we can calculate the Young's modulus, we can interpret the ultimate strength and toughness of the material. And then we can also evaluate the accuracy. So this is confusion matrix between the actual MD result and the prediction from generative AI and the simple algorithm for mechanics calculation to see like most cases, so they agree with the MD output. So there's still some disagreement, but we are improving our performance. And then here's the summary of the workflow. So generative AI, they generate the design of stress field together with the material distribution. And we use the path-based mechanics analysis to predict Young's modulus strength and toughness. And then we can sort those conformations by certain order. For example, here we sort it by the ultimate strength. And then we can turn that into 3D printed structures. We use our tensor machine to do the test. This is broken structures. And here's just a movie showing the test process. So we use aluminum tab to glue the specimen, and then use this instrument machine to apply loading. And we get stress strain curve, and we compare those ultimate strengths of the 5 samples. So this rank perfectly agree with the prediction from the generative AI together with our mechanics analysis. So we are happy about that. We're going to repeat this test on more structures and to verify these methods is useful and is efficient to generate some arbitrary designs of composite. So given that, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of my group. So my PhD graduate students and also undergraduate students, my collaborators, and the funding agencies. So without that, I won't make those progress. And thank you, everyone.